200 years ago, Singapore was a jungle, an obscure tropical island, barely inhabited. Back then, Singapore was an important island at the center of a thriving Malay kingdom. It was known as Temasek and appears on the earliest Chinese maps of the region. January 1819, a small expeditionary force has arrived on the island, working for the British East India Company. The leader is a highly ambitious, determined young man, an official of the company. His name would become forever linked with Singapore. He is Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles.
This whole region was full of traders all over the place. There are many river mouths, small ports. So what Raffles did was to provide them with a place where they could come and trade freely. By providing that service, the word got around very, very quickly, and all these people realized that this was a tremendous advantage. If they brought all their trade to Singapore, they could bring in all kinds of goods, sell almost anything they could get without having to pay taxes. And there was just nothing like that anywhere else in Asia.
This was Raffles' big idea: free trade. The Enlightenment in Europe was an age of reason, order, and progress. And Raffles hoped to bring these lofty ideals to Singapore. While the town was still in its infancy, he drew up an elaborate blueprint for its future, laying out a modern grid structure of roads, dividing up the population into different ethnic areas. Everything was designed to be as rational and efficient as possible. In Raffles' vision, the river would be the central artery of the town, along which trade could flow. He created a wharf, Boat Quay, to be a focal point for mercantile establishments.
Singapore had a completely fresh start. It was now seen and recognized, not simply as just the route to China alone, but simply as the port for anybody who's trading in this whole region. And this became increasingly the role of Singapore.
In modern economic jargon, Singapore had become the hub of Southeast Asia, the first port of call for Western ships wanting to operate in the region.
If a ship were to come from London and distribute various products, it would be much more economical if you come to a center. And from that center, it will be broken up into smaller parcels and distribute to different parts of Southeast Asia. That is the concept of a hub. As the region gets richer and richer, Singapore was trading with more and more countries, and up to today, Singapore is the 16th biggest trading country in the world. 16th, which is not too bad for a small place.
This is some of the oldest surviving cinefilm of Singapore, shot at the beginning of the 20th century. It shows a cosmopolitan city alive with the energy and enterprise of its people. It's also an orderly, efficient city, as Raffles had hoped it would be. But how much of Raffles' vision is still alive today? Modern Singapore is a 21st century Asian metropolis, a world away from the coolies and bumboats of old. Singapore of old was the creation of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles. But the modern city-state has been the work of another man, Lee Kuan Yew. In June 1959, the PAP swept to power on a tide of mass support. On the steps of City Hall stood the first native-born Singaporean to control the island.
Saudara-saudara, saudari-saudari setanah air, merdeka! Lagi sekali yang bersemangat merdeka! Riwayat lama.
But from the start, the new Prime Minister had limited room for maneuver.
There was no joy on election night. We knew we were taking office, and it was a crown of thorns.
Lee Kuan Yew had fulfilled his dream of steering Singapore out of the British Empire and into a merger with Malaya. In September 1963, a new country was born. The S and the I from Singapore were inserted into Malaya to form Malaysia. But from being number one in Singapore, he was now number two in Malaysia. Behind the personality clash were fundamental political differences, which would soon spill over into racial violence on the streets of Singapore. Singapore's path through the 20th century had been traumatic. But the most painful moment of all was fast approaching for one man. He'd set his heart and gambled his credibility on a merger with Malaya, and lost.
You know, every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish.
I had, I suppose, a sense of guilt of having got so many people involved in this problem, and I had to face them.
All my life,
the feelings welled up. It was a difficult emotional problem.
Would you mind if we stop for a while?
The Malaysian brigadier who was in charge of the brigade here, he said, "Sir, I've been given orders to escort you from your office to Parliament." I did a quick think. I said, oh, this is the Tunku demonstrating to the world that our independence is by his leave and license. So I said, yes, thank you very much. I thought, oh, I don't have a single soldier that will respond to my orders. My soldiers were then under his control. It was going to happen again and again until we are able to say, no, you don't. I don't need this, thank you very much.
Defense became the #1 priority for the new Singaporean state. But who would be prepared to give them military help? Israel, like Singapore, was a small country surrounded by larger Muslim neighbors, and its army had a fearsome reputation. At the time, it had very few allies in the developing world, so was keen to offer the hand of friendship to Singapore. In 1966, Singapore created a citizens' militia army based on the Israeli model. The entire male population did national service and received military training, so they could then be called up in a time of crisis. The leaders of the country were heavily influenced by the British welfare state and its ability to clear slums and provide modern, affordable homes. They wanted the same for Singapore.
The families, which had once lived in slums, now had private entrances, glass windows, piped water, gas, and electricity.
The government embarked on a massive public building program, creating huge estates across the island, rehousing the vast majority of the population. But there was always a fundamental difference between the Singaporean and British approach. Instead of renting out apartments, people were encouraged to buy them. Lee Kuan Yew wanted to avoid the sort of dependency culture he had seen emerging in Britain.
We started selling a few blocks. I said, this is yours. You pay it by installment over 20 years. And we could see the stark difference between a owner-occupied high-rise and a rented high-rise. One was cared after, looked after, precious because it's theirs. The other just declines. So we decided that we'll give everybody a chance to own their own home.
The landscape of Asia is changing, and Singapore is having to change with it. For 40 years, the city-state has been a manufacturing powerhouse, making the most of its efficient, obedient workforce.
The greatest danger which Singapore faces today, in my view, is that we have been so successful in the past. And the temptation is always there, that when you have a model which has given you success, you tend to believe that that model will continue forever, and you extrapolate into the future. But the point is that the world has changed. The new economy is about ideas. It's a more treacherous field for the government to embark in, because the path ahead is not as clear.
Ironically, the new future Singapore faces is not so different from the world into which it was born. In the 19th century, it was a small island on the trade route between India and China, having to survive on its wits. In the 21st century, it faces exactly the same challenge again.
We had a period when the big countries withdrew into themselves, and now a reopening up and a re-efflorescence. And suddenly, what we were created to do, we are now able to do again. It's almost like a return to the past.